Our next speaker is Lynn Mcneil. Lynn holds a PhD in folklore from Memorial University of Newfoundland and currently teaches folklore and composition courses, both online and face-to-face at Utah State University. She taught her first hybrid online course in 1999, and the study of digital culture has been a major focus of her research since 2003. She's published book chapters and journal articles on a wide variety of subjects, has appeared as a judge on the Food Network, and is currently at work on a Folklore Studies textbook. Her session this afternoon is entitled Bowling Alone as Team Sport, Helping Students Engage in an Online Course. Lynn, are you ready to get started?
Yep, I think I'm ready. Are you able to see what you need to see?
Yep, you can go ahead and get started, and I'll leave you alone for now, Lynn, and I'll talk to you at the end of the session.
All right, thank you so much. Welcome everybody to this session. I appreciate you being here. As Amy said, I not only teach composition, but I also teach folklore classes. And it is largely as a folklorist that I'm here talking to you today. One of the things that I study is digital culture, the ways we socialize and express ourselves culturally online. And so I'm here today to talk about some strategies for making the most of an online composition class experience, sort of with that cultural bent in mind. Clearly, much of the skill of teaching composition in general translates from a face-to-face setting to an online setting. But there are also some obstacles that need to be overcome that go beyond learning the technology or knowing the pedagogy of composition, that deal more with the culture of the online classroom. So one of the biggest obstacles in an online class, especially an entirely online class rather than a hybrid, is overcoming the perceived distance between you and your students. So the phrase bowling alone originated in 1995 with an article by Harvard professor of public policy Robert Putnam, in which he illustrated and decried the increasing social disengagement that he perceived in American society. One of the things he cited as evidence of the deterioration of social networks was that while more people than ever are bowling, there are far fewer bowling leagues than there have been in the past. And now Putnam's work has since been published as a book, and it's been controversial throughout. But his phrase, bowling alone, is really useful in that it's become emblematic of the many concerns that we have about increasing social isolation in contemporary society. Of course, online classes, as a component of online interaction in general, are one of the many examples of the kinds of things that worry people when they consider contemporary mediated communication. There is an incredibly pervasive and very popular perception that technologically mediated communication leads to social impoverishment, disengagement, the general degradation of society as a whole. And this is something we hear people say a lot in general. We hear things like, young people don't know how to have a conversation anymore. And we hear the same criticism leveled against online classes. We hear people say things like, I just don't think you can really learn without sitting in a classroom with a teacher. Now, this seems like a new idea, this concern about mediated communication, because it's being applied to new technology, but it's really a long-standing idea. Consider this warning that I just put up on the slides. I'll let you read it for yourselves, but just to draw your attention to some of the key points that are being made here, it's talking about this invention or discovery that will create forgetfulness. People will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will have the show of wisdom without the reality. Now, this is a quote that I love showing to my students because the first time I encountered it, I thought immediately of the Wikipedia, the way that we can get almost instantaneous information on any topic, however questionable that information may be, and we can sound as if we know something about it, when really we've not studied or learned it thoroughly at all. So the show of wisdom indeed. But this quote here is talking about a much earlier communications medium, the alphabet. As you can see here, this is Socrates being quoted by Plato around the year 370 BCE. Now, Socrates firmly believed that writing down our knowledge rather than passing it on in a face-to-face setting was a total threat to our intelligence and to the quality of our learning and our engagement and our understanding. And in fact, all new media technologies, from the alphabet to the telegraph to the telephone to the television, have faced similar criticism, but as time has shown, we've been able to adapt those technologies and adapt to them and still retain our genuine social relationships. We may not have completely mastered the latest incarnation of mediated communication, the internet, but there's no reason to assume that there won't be ways to overcome the limitations that technology puts on our relationships with our students. Now, there are many, many ways to create a good social environment in an online classroom. Some are very basic and deal with the construction of the classroom. Others are more theoretical and deal with your approach to your students and the virtual space that you share. Since we have limited time here, I want to try and touch a little bit on both of those aspects, starting with the basic setup and design questions that address the unique space, the virtual space of an online classroom. So organizationally, when setting up your online classroom, the first thing you want to do is try and see this space the way that your students see it. If you're teaching an entirely online course where your students will never meet you nor each other in person, you really need to embrace that your perception of the class as a semester-long, purposefully designed entity populated with 20-odd students is not what your students perceive, especially initially. As far as they know, they are bowling alone. They interact with this online space in a solitary, isolated manner. They have no initial sense of the bowling league that you have put together for them. So rather than assuming that the class speaks for itself as an engaged social space, you want to design it so that it speaks for you and engages your students for the ways in which they will be perceiving it. So at the most initial level, there are two types of information that should be readily available to students from their initial login. The first is background information. This is information that is available in full from the beginning of the semester and that stays the same throughout. So things that are not going to change or be different as students continue to encounter them. Things like the course syllabus, the overall calendar, some write-up or video of how the class works, your contact info, things like that. The next kind of information that you're going to have is metered information. And again, the difference is how it gets delivered. This information gets delivered in segments, and that can be weekly, bi-weekly, tri-weekly, however you have organized your class. But this is information that builds on itself over the course of the semester. So things like weekly assignments, discussions, readings that are not all laid out from the get-go, but that build as time goes by. So there's a clear distinction between one-time delivery info and ongoing delivery info, and both these elements need to be obvious and differentiated for students. They need to know what they don't need to check in with every week and what they do need to check in with every week. There should be a clearly marked central begin here place that gives students from their first login all the background information that they'll need. And that should also include where they need to go for each subsequent login for the metered information. Now, an important thing to remember about this is that redundancy is good, but scatter isn't. So again, we need to be thinking about this from our students' perspective. Let's say that you are teaching an online course and you send out an orientation email with information about how the class works, and you've also created a begin here link in the classroom with the same information because you can't be sure which inroad any given student will apprehend first when they begin taking your class. This redundancy is good because students have double the chances to get the information they need about how this course works. But it also risks scatter. And now, one of the most stressful experiences that online students report is not being sure that they're finding all the information they need or all the information that this class offers. So for a student who both receives the email and reads the Begin Here link, you want to make sure that you state in each place that the information is the same as in the other. Saying something like, now if you've received my welcome email, you already know this, but here's how the class works. Students are surprisingly not bothered by repetition as long as it's clearly labeled as repetition. Truly, they're just relieved to have it confirmed that they're getting the same info twice, rather than having to suspect that they're getting additional, possibly different information that they're supposed to do something different with. So within the classroom in general, as many cues as can be given about where the central hub of information is located, that Begin Here link or whatever, is good. You want to funnel students' attention toward that central hub. The thing is, today's students, they like to explore. And in fact, learning by doing, by engaging, rather than by reading a manual, is often touted as one of the defining qualities of digital natives, which many college students are age-wise these days. I once had a student who completely bypassed the enormous course content link on the homepage of our online classroom and went straight to the link that he, for whatever reason, perceived to be first in the online classroom, which was the discussion forums. And, you know, he found some discussion assignments there, and so he happily went about doing them for the first weeks of class, all the while totally missing out on my podcast lectures, lecture notes, and reading assignments. So I think we can quite rightfully call this particular student clueless. I mean, who would think that there was nothing but discussion forums to an online class? But his case does make a point. He explored, he found information, he did what it told him. And what I learned from that experience was to make sure that, one, I have a link called Begin Here on the homepage, not just course content. I can't assume that course content comes before discussions for students, but Begin Here certainly does. And two, that each area of my classroom, any space that the students might encounter, especially during the first week, clearly states at the top of the page, if you've found this forum or this calendar or this assessment before visiting the Begin Here link, go back and check that one out. Again, these students experientially are here alone. They can't glance left or right and see what the rest of their classmates are doing. And actually, this lack of visual group awareness is really, really important. It's one of the major obstacles that we find in all virtual communication, and it really affects the design of an online classroom. A physical classroom, a traditional brick-and-mortar classroom, provides a wealth of social cues for students that go far beyond a student listening to the announcements and lectures made by their instructors. For example, a student who is daydreaming in his or her classroom will notice peripherally when all his or her classmates suddenly sit up straighter and take pens out, and that student will tune back in accordingly and find out about the new due date that they otherwise would have missed out on. Social cues like this are an enormous part of most people's comprehension of any situation and are almost entirely absent from an online classroom. And they're definitely absent in the first week before any of the interactive aspects of the class have begun. So they're really not going to notice what their classmates are doing and think, oh, maybe I should be doing that myself. So as an instructor, it becomes your job to create these cues for your students to appropriately direct and redirect their attention regardless of where it may wander. Now, design aside, the other thing that I want to focus on is the importance of letting your students know that you are a real person and not just another online textbook from which they're going to receive weekly messages. It is equally important, of course, that they see each other as real people too, as ideally they'll be working together, workshopping, peer reviewing each other's writing. There is a reason that flaming, if you're not familiar with that term, flaming is excessively nasty and aggressive comments in an online setting. There's a reason that's prevalent on the internet and in online classes. I've heard some horror stories from my students, and that is something that will destroy a community of writers real fast. So here's where we start to see the deeper implications of bowling alone for online education, beyond pragmatic questions of design and beyond assistance with comprehension and orientation. Providing your students with a sense of social presence is a major factor in increasing student engagement. Social presence is understood as a feeling of interpersonal contact and immediacy that people have when in the presence of others. And we often gain our sense of social presence through the use of various social cues, which include things like gestures, facial expressions, body stance, someone's voice, that can be their tone, their volume, their pacing, and even things like clothing, style, gender, and race. These are ways in which people are made real and present to us when we are in their company. And now this last category is often brought up when people champion the equality that can be found through virtual communication. A lot of times it's seen as a boon that people can communicate without any bias that might stem from their gender, class, or race, or things like this. But in a positive way, these are the ways in which we simply form a concept of another person as a unique individual. We differentiate between the masses of students who are in our classes by what they look like. People who engage in flaming online would often never say the things they'll say online to a person whose face they could see, whose body language they could read, whose reaction they would be aware of. And it is a major concern in online culture that this limitation of social cues can lead to a disregard for others, to the lack of intimacy and social co-presence opens the door for people to remain socially disengaged and isolated. Now, when we talk about mediated communication lacking or being limited in social cues and social presence, we worry about the impoverishment of interpersonal contact, because what we're really being limited in is social intimacy, this idea of co-presence. That's what these social cues are giving us. And again, these are considered the mainstays of rich, meaningful social interaction. And this is what people are talking about when they try to articulate why mediated interaction is worse than face-to-face interaction. You can't hug each other, not that we're hugging our students all the time, but you can't pat someone on the back or shake their hand. You're not sharing the same physical environment, which might lead to greater cohesion and understanding by reacting to the same stimuli and things like that. Now, these are really serious concerns, especially for a composition class, where instructors are much more like coaches than lecturers. We are encouraging and supporting the practice of a skill rather than simply passing along information. The subject matter is often very personal to students, and students need to be engaged in order to learn. Composition classes are not a setting where you can simply cram and regurgitate information to pass a test. Not to mention the fact that peer interaction is a mainstay of the learning process in a writing class. So I want to talk about the various opportunities that online instructors have to overcome these obstacles. The use of rich media can be one way to do this, one way to emphasize that you are a real person and create a sense of genuine co-presence. Now, one of the most straightforward ways this can be accomplished is through the use of audio and video technologies, or a combination of both of these. Now, I totally understand, and it certainly applies to me too, that full video lectures are not for everyone. I myself tried exactly once to make a complete video lecture as a welcome message to my students, and it was mortifying. I used my built-in webcam on my computer. I looked like a 15-year-old making a video on YouTube. It was awful. But there are a variety of other options. What I ended up doing was overlaying an audio recording of me explaining how the class works onto a slideshow. That included pictures of me, our campus, screenshots of the classroom, etc. So rather than reconceptualizing an online class as a television show in order to incorporate more social cues, the goal is to try to cultivate rich media moments. Even just a few rich media moments in an online class can add depth to the textual material. Think about it this way. Think about how when you get an email or a letter from a close friend, you can picture him or her saying the words that they've written. You can imagine their tone as though they were saying it to you. This is something that human beings do instinctively. We use our memories of past embodied co-presence to fill in and enrich the situations where social cues are more limited. And of course, your students can do the very same thing. They can take a brief exposure to your voice, your image, your personality, and overlay it onto the less expressive communications they receive, like typed lectures, for example. One thing that is really important, though, is to allow your genuine voice and personality to really come through in these rich media moments. Your goal should not be to create a professional-looking training video. It should be to introduce yourself as a genuine human being. Now, this is also true. This is especially true, in fact, in online classrooms that are heavily textual, that rely mainly on written lectures, written discussions, and written assignments. The thing to remember is that when we teach face-to-face, we don't have only one voice or only one mode of interacting. We move between several. We move between formal lecture, casual discussion, and even friendly, non-course related chat before and after class. And this is where many online classes fall apart as engaging social spaces. The use of rich media isn't enough here, because moments of rich media, for the most part, aren't interactive. They're passive. You can present yourself to your students in a pre-recorded video, but you can't react to them or see their reactions to you. And since most online classes are asynchronous and therefore text-based in their interactive elements, meaning that you're not all online at the same time conducting a live webcast with your students, my main suggestions are going to be about this type of asynchronous course. My first piece of advice is learn to embrace online chat norms. Now, this is a difficult one for many instructors who, quite understandably, can't figure out how to maintain an appearance of authority while writing things like LOL and making smiley faces with punctuation marks. But remember, in a face-to-face class, you manage to retain your authority during lectures, even though you chat with students about how their weekends were before class. It is an easy assumption to make that using typed slang automatically is juvenile. But there are 2 points to consider here. One reason that we associate typed slang with young people is that they simply adapt the technology to their needs faster than older people do. They have made technology more expressively useful in order to suit their varied communication needs. So rather than seeing casual typed communication as juvenile, we need to see it as expressively useful, as a way to embody voice in text. A second point to consider is that there's no need to equate being casual in your written voice with grammatically atrocious, incomprehensible lingo. We want to strive for coherent casualness. Now, we all know, and in fact, we teach our students that people use different voices in different rhetorical situations. We speak casually to a friend and formally to an employer. There are even people who speak with an accent when they're at home and no accent when they're at work or in the classroom. This is a common social thing that people do, and typed communication should be just the same. We would email our friends differently than we would email our boss. The way to utilize this idea of a text voice in your classroom is to create the opportunity for a variety of rhetorical situations and then to employ a variety of voices accordingly. So in written lectures, you will obviously be formal and grammatically precise. But in the discussion forums, where students might be posting preliminary ideas for paper topics or sharing their previous experiences with writing, taking the time to respond really briefly with a simple, how cool, or that sounds great, or I tried that too once, how fun. That is one of the best ways to indicate social presence. It reminds the students that you are there in that space with them. One of the hardest aspects of online teaching, and if you've done it, then you know this, is the incredible amount of time it takes to to respond to student posts. In a physical classroom, an instructor can listen to several students' comments in a row, nodding, indicating agreement and interest with gestures and posture, and then say something like, "Those are great points, everyone. Now let's all consider this." In an online classroom, group replies tend to feel really impersonal. All your students have posted and then you add a post at the bottom of the forum. But individual replies become really time-consuming and tedious. You find yourself repeating the things you've said because it's legitimate that you have the same message often to give several students. Now, unfortunately, unresponsive instructors are a major common complaint from online students. But this is where cultivating a more casual text voice can really come in handy. Learning to utilize the typed equivalent of a nod or a facial expression of agreement saves a ton of time but still cultivates your presence in the classroom. And this low-level interaction also accomplishes two other important goals. One, it models for students ways for them to reply to and encourage each other outside of the formalized interactions of assignments and peer review. And two, it discourages flaming because it fills the void of social cues and asserts the regular and consistent co-presence of all members of the classroom. So, where are we? Oop, there we are. In summary, I want to go over the main points that I have made here today. Mediated interaction, as in online classrooms, worries a whole lot of people because it filters out many of the social cues that are necessary for comprehension and especially for engagement. Some principles of classroom design, such as labeled repetition and attention funneling, can help provide students with cues as they explore their classrooms, filling in those social cues they would get in a physical classroom. The use of rich media, even in the briefest of rich media moments, can provide enough immediacy and intimacy for students to overlay onto less rich interaction and communication. And the purposeful utilization of a variety of voices in typed communication settings can help students perceive themselves as part of a real, genuine, engaged social situation, just like a bowling league. That's all I've got for you, folks. Let me know if you have questions.
Okay, Lynn, I have a question as we're kind of waiting for the question feature to sort of rev up. I wanted to ask about discussions. I've been kind of back and forth about what kinds of, I don't know, what kinds of topics, produce kind of a rich discussion base. And I've gone back and forth between having things in there that are really just kind of personal responses to things we're reading or to things we talk about in class, versus or in addition to including kind of some low-stakes writing assignments, something a little bit more formal and analytical in the discussion space, largely so that I can, I guess, show students who are not quite hitting the mark. I feel like if they're in the discussion group, posting some of these low-stakes writings with students who are really going above and beyond, that having them all in one space, sharing those kinds of writing assignments together is helpful to all of them. But like I said, I've been back and forth over this for years, and I never really settle on a good use of the discussion, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience with that and your thoughts on what the discussion is best for.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because I think, and well, the quick answer is I think that the discussion component of an online class actually pulls double duty, if not triple duty. I think lots of components of the class happen there because that space in the classroom is the most equivalent to the physical space of a shared classroom setting where lots of different types of talk and production and creation happen. And one of the things that is difficult about that is our course management systems aren't necessarily ready to keep up with us on that. And I don't have the solution for that, but we tend to have one discussion forum where it falls to us, the instructor, to separate out different types of assignments. One of the ways that I like to deal with this question of what type of discussion is best is by designating certain permanent forums that are there for a certain particular kind of interaction. So every semester I have a casual Q&A forum that's always at the top of my forum list, where students who are going, I can't figure out what I'm supposed to read this week, or is anyone else having trouble opening lecture number 7, or something like that, all of that stuff can go there. It's very, very casual. I can monitor it regularly. But I also have a separate forum that is also permanent, also at the top of the list, that's just for fun stuff, you know, whatever relates to our course material, whatever we're talking about, neat websites. I mean, there are a lot of really fun, hilarious grammar blogs, for instance, that are out on the internet these days. And I like to model the kind of stuff I want my students to post in that fun forum by just really casually being like, hey guys, have you seen this hilarious comic someone wrote about the semicolon? And then I'll post the link there. And you know, different semesters have different cultures, just like in a physical classroom. You can have a talkative bunch and a quiet bunch, a different semester. But a lot of times students will take that model that I've posted and respond to it, you know, casually and fun or whatever. And they're pretty adept at acknowledging that something different is supposed to happen in that forum than in one of the more formalized weekly assignment forums where they're posting a more formal piece of writing and then responding to it casually. I actually give long, probably longer than they need to be, long descriptions of the difference between what I call often in my classes reading responses and discussion replies. Reading responses are formal pieces of writing. Discussion replies are where those real, you know, low anxiety, wow, that's awesome, I love what you did there, sort of responses come in. And once we've gone through, and I make sure in the early weekly forums that I'm modeling those different kinds of responses as well. And students seem to grasp fairly quickly as long as it's consistent and consistently described. Each week you want to use the same language for explaining whether something is a more formal piece of writing or a more casual piece of writing. And then students are really able to differentiate that single forum space for themselves once they've seen those guidelines in action a few times.
Gotcha. A couple people have wondered what do you call some of your permanent forums? Like, what do you call your casual Q&A forum and your fun stuff forum? Do you have any suggested names?
You know what? That's a great question, and I think my answer is really boring because I call my Q&A forum Q&A, and I call my fun forum just for fun! Exclamation point. And another thing that is so important, and this goes back to students needing all the information to sort of be thrown at them, is at the top of the forum, it's made clear to students whether or not I expect them to post in that forum, whether their grade is affected by their posting in that forum, or whether it is just there for them to use or ignore as they choose, because that's something that will stress them out. If they see a forum and it's called just for fun, but they see their classmates are posting in there, but they're not, they start to worry, and I like to make it clear that is a no-stakes forum. Forget low stakes, it's no stakes. You can post there, you can ignore it, whatever. And that, having that information right when they access that forum really helps them as well.
That's a great idea. Sharon Muldoon is wondering about what are your thoughts on creating a chat forum for your online class?
That is a great question, and it's something that I haven't necessarily utilized on an entire class level because at Utah State, where I'm teaching, our online courses are there mostly to supplement our on-campus and regional campus courses, so we are strongly discouraged from requiring students to be online at any given time. And that's really the downside to being able to get a lot of experiences with chat, is it's difficult to say to students everyone has to be on at 5 p.m. Wednesday when they've taken this course so that they can conceivably be somewhere else at 5 p.m. on Wednesdays. But I do often make live synchronous chat available to my students when they're working in groups. so that if that is a form of communication that, say, 5 of them want to coordinate so that they can get together and discuss something or put together, some collective effort that they can use. One of the other things I find, though, and this I hope this isn't me just dodging the question, because the real answer is I don't use that feature a lot, and it's difficult because of the way the courses that I teach are required to function. But one thing I find myself thinking a lot is that online classrooms need, as I even said in my talk, to embrace the norms of online culture. A lot of our students, socializing online is normal to them. That's how it works. Most of them are not live audio chatting with their friends online. The conventional mode of online synchronous chat is typed. It's integrated into Facebook, Instant Messenger uses it, Gmail uses it, all the various email programs use it, and that, I find, is the most familiar way for synchronous, engaged communication to happen for students, despite you'd expect that audio chat would really allow for a lot of those social cues to be sent back in. Text chat really is better. So I do know a lot of instructors who simply open the chat window in their online classroom whenever they're on, so that it might not be a required part of the assignment, but it's sort of a catch me if you can for students. I know that I use Instant Messenger for my students because then I don't have to be on a computer that can access my course management system. I have Instant Messenger on my phone, so if I'm away from my desk, we can still communicate with chat that way. So I think it has incredible promise, especially since text chat is so natural for students already. But it's not something that I have a ton of experience with, and certainly not something that I think can be required in a class that's designed to be asynchronous.
Okay. Becky Duncan at Lawson State Community College is wondering, do you use a rubric for grading discussions? And if so, how do you factor in like the informal chatting that might be happening within that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I tend to do is I make the more formalized discussion assignments where they're responding to a prompt from me are always worth 10 points, sort of regardless of what weekly participation is as a percentage of their final grade. I'll just, take whatever percentage of however many discussions we had at the end. But I make them worth 10 points, and for the most part, as long as the student has done it, if there is a post in that forum from them, they're not going to score less than 7 out of 10, so a C minus. So anywhere from 7, 8, 9, 10 points is sort of my way of grade, because again, these, in my class at least, these tend to be fairly informal assignments, not just casual low-stakes discussion, but it's also not formal essay writing. These are somewhat in between. So I have a really sort of easy grading breakdown for that. But at the end of the semester, I'll always give, often it's the equivalent of 3 or 4 additional discussion forums just for someone's engaged presence in the classroom. I don't want that to be something that fails someone. There are a lot of online students who just aren't comfortable socializing, really genuinely socializing in an online environment. They may be comfortable emailing me their assignments, completing the work that I give, but this idea of just visiting with their classmates in the online classroom, it's just not a natural thing for them. And I don't want anyone's grade to suffer because of that. But for the people that I do see going through and really modeling what I've set up on that level of just engaged reaction, telling people, oh, hey, I went to that place that you wrote about this week too, and I thought it was great, stuff like that, I do try to have some wiggle room points in there so the people that do that are rewarded, where the people that don't do it don't necessarily suffer terribly.
Gotcha. Kind of a related question is coming from Acacia Ramirez, who's a graduate student at my own alma mater at the University of North Texas. And the question has to do with, in an online class, sometimes students have a tendency to think that they can just log in, once or twice a week. And as a result, they might miss announcements and necessary adjustments to due dates or assignment requirements. And so do you have any recommendations for dealing with that?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I tell my students, and it's one of the first things that I say in my welcome message that lies behind the Begin Here link, is online classes are designed to be more flexible than a face-to-face class, but that does not in any way imply that they're going to be easier or less time-consuming than a face-to-face class. And I think re-emphasizing that message to students, one, can start to chip away at this perception that they just need to check in every once in a while. I've had students not check in until week 7, halfway through the semester, and find out that there have been due dates they've missed all along. And, you know, you try and target that with preliminary emails sent outside of the online classroom email app, because you never know if those are getting forwarded to their personal email accounts, so there are a lot of ways to get their initial attention on that. The other thing that I do is I try and offer them flexibility within something of a rigid structure. I tell my students, similar to a Tuesday-Thursday class, that they have to log on twice in the week, once before Wednesday, once after Wednesday. Now, they may have to log on to do all their work, much more than that. But that is what I am at the base level requiring of them. No assignment, no weekly assignment will be due before Wednesday. So if they can't log on until Tuesday afternoon, they've still got time to complete their first assignment. And there's not going to be any new metered information that appears in the week. For me, all my metered information shows up first thing Monday morning with explanations of what to do by Wednesday, what additional work to do by Friday. That twice a week thing, I find, allows me to have some pretty good discussions. You know, post your semi-formal assignment by Wednesday, respond to each other by Friday. That sort of pattern works for me. And then as far as announcements and last-minute stuff goes, there's a little bit of an acceptance of delay, of things taking extra time, I feel, in an online class. If I make an announcement Monday, I know I've told my students they have to have logged on by the end of the day Wednesday for the first time, but if they logged on already earlier than me on Monday, they may not get it until their second login of the week. And I try as hard as I can to not have essential, you've got to do this by a certain time information come in announcements for that very reason. What I do use is group emails, and I try to keep those to a minimum. I don't feel that my students need to feel like I'm spamming them, because then they'll start ignoring what I say. But if I make sure that time-sensitive information gets delivered to their inboxes, their main inboxes, not their in-classroom inboxes, that's one way that I've found to sort of help negotiate that.
Okay. Lynn, we're kind of running out of time, but there were a couple quick related questions also about discussions. One is about whether or not you think it's a good idea to require a certain number of responses to peers within the discussion post. And second, Brian Powell at Liberty is wondering what you think about the idea of staying mostly out of the discussion boards so as not to skew the direction of the student post. Or, I mean, there's a lot of things published about that. You know, kind of a best practices. Is it a best practice to be present in the discussion, or to let the discussion seem like it's something happening more within between peers? So, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as for the first question, a required number of responses, I do require a base number of responses for my students, and it depends on what class it is that I'm teaching, but often what I'll say is reply to the 2 posts made immediately after yours. So rather than simply saying make 2 replies, because what students then tend to do is go to the post that most people have already replied to, assuming it to be the most interesting, or they'll get ideas for something to post from other people. I really like to a little bit force their hands and make everyone at least be replied to twice, you know, because each student is responding to 2 people. And then beyond that is where students who are really taking to heart my recommendation for engagement will sometimes, I have students who make 17 posts a week, and then I have students who make just the basic 2. But I do feel, knowing the range of students who are in any online class, there are some who simply never would if I didn't require a certain number of responses. So that's how I deal with that. As far as staying out of the discussion forums goes, I think this is a really complex question that deals with the culture of authority in any classroom, much less an online classroom. But what I find, and and this is coming actually from feedback students have given me. My students know that I do online cultural research, and I've had them send me screen caps even of some of their online class discussions, and flaming is real. And we may think it won't happen in a college classroom setting. It does. I have seen shocking personal attacks take place in discussion forums, and what my students always tell me is the professor didn't even know until I emailed him. You know, he had no idea that this was taking place. Now, that's not common. That's not very, very, you know, typical. Luckily, that doesn't happen all the time. But the level of alienation it causes, not just for a student whose views are being personally attacked, but for the rest of the class watching this happen and not seeing any authoritative figure come in and say anything, can be dangerous. So that doesn't necessarily mean an instructor has to post. It does mean an instructor has to read every single thing that is posted in the discussion forums. And I know that's time consuming, but that's the only way that students, that you're going to be able to nip something like that in the bud, is to know exactly what's being said. Now, other opportunities, of course, the time spent in the discussion forums I like to equate to the physical time spent sitting in the classroom, in which case the instructor is there hearing the comments that are being made. They are considered in-class discussions. So I don't think that is too inappropriate. It may be necessary to provide students with opportunities to speak in private the way they could if they walked out your classroom door in a physical classroom, and making sure that they have access to each other's email addresses, letting them know they're welcome to talk to each other is fine. But I feel that that equivalent in-class discussion time, I think it is essential that instructors be keeping up with what's being said and really be ready to illustrate their consistent presence. And again, just with those few little markers of hey, that's neat, or I really agree with that, but what did you think about what so-and-so said 3 posts up? What that does, beyond any specific content of that post, is it just communicates, I'm listening, I'm here, I see what you say, I see what's going on, and that really disinclines people to start in on the more aggressive social behavior.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lynn, there's a couple other questions, and I'm going to go ahead and we'll send them to you after the conference is over, and maybe you can get back with some of those people. They're all very, very interesting, and I wish we had longer to go on, but I know you're at a conference and probably need to move on to that. And I wanted to thank you so much for your time and the great information, and I hope I'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been really fun to talk about it.
Great. Bye now.